Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 1724. The topic is nutrition and the title is this a good diet? So I had somebody send in a question recently. They asked the difference between a couple different diets, and it led to a general discussion of how would we know if something is a good diet. In the conversation I got into with the listener, we talked about four basic questions. I'm sure you could break this down and find a lot more nuances, but I just want to present a stream of thought that would maybe get everybody moving in a direction of kind of analyzing diets, whether they're actually good or not, rather than do I think I can follow this. Like, most people pick diets because, I want to lose 30 pounds. This looks the closest to what I already do now. I don't have to change much, so I'll just do this. Or, yeah, this one's super simple. I can understand. I'm just going to do that. Overwhelmingly, most people focus on diets based on how easy they are to follow. And that's not really a good idea. That's a component. You do have to understand a diet. And the easier a diet is to follow, the more you can be adherent to the diet. So I do understand that. But most people are looking at a diet being easy as a way out of challenge, a way out of having to change their normal habits. They're looking at it as a lazy way. Not in the sense of, oh, will this help me adhere to the diet better? More like, I don't want to have to change anything I'm doing. This is good enough. So one example, and I'm about to talk smack on a diet. It doesn't mean that I entirely think the whole premise is crap, but it's a often abused diet is intermittent fasting. So people eat like jackasses, and they skip breakfast, they eat lunch maybe, and then they eat all their food at night. And they're maybe not continuing to gain weight, they're holding at a steady weight, but they're unhappy with the way they look. There's more body fat and not enough muscle mass for what they want, and they're like, this is a bummer, I really would love to kind of tighten up, I want to lose a little bit of weight. Well, it looks like with intermittent fasting, I can just eat all my calories between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. So I'll continue to skip breakfast. Now I'll definitely skip lunch, even though I was already skipping it sometimes. And I'll just eat all my food between 5 and 9 p.m. You were already doing that, and it already didn't work. The reason why it might work initially is because all of a sudden you're now counting your calories between 5 and 9 p.m. And that's going to help you lose a little bit of initial weight. Maybe you start choosing a little bit of healthier foods. So that reduces sugars, that helps lose a little bit of water retention, you maybe have a little better energy, but you could have just counted your calories and chose better foods and still ate breakfast and ate lunch. Like you didn't, the benefits didn't come from doing that in a certain time frame, they came from just doing that. So if we look at how the body works, there's going to be a lot of conflicting content out there in the world right now, because a lot of times it's either people are trying to sell something, whether it's a diet strategy that they promote or a product they sell, they're often just trying to sell something, or somebody found some weird unique thing that works for them, and then they extrapolate that to say that everyone else needs to be following this. When that's just not true. It's just maybe a conditional issue where they ended up working out well for them. But it's just frustrating because, one of the things is our body uses energy. It when we eat food, our body breaks that down into individual components that it can use to repair and build muscle tissue. It can repair and, do things with cells, a lot of other processes in the body. It might provide us with energy. There's just various uses to the food. But our body is always 24/7 needing those elements to continue to fix things, address things, run things. It's just our body runs 24/7. So it makes more sense to supply it with the energy it needs at a relatively even rate throughout the day, than it would to lump all that up to one time. Now, people will talk about digestive stress. Well, you reduce irritation, like inflammation in the gut. Well, not really. I mean, they've done studies, and you can limit digestion-related inflammation by having it come at one lump sum at the time of the day, but it's still a really high hit on the body. Whereas if you eat smaller meals spread throughout the day, you're doing more frequent inflammation due to digestion, but it's kind of the same like lump sum amount, it's just more spread out. And also, if you just choose better foods, that doesn't cause as much inflammation. So there's multiple factors, and it can be challenging if you're following along to anything I've said so far. You can hear that it's kind of challenging because there's a lot of theories, a lot of strategies, a lot of ideas, and it's going to sound like everyone believes they're right. So how do you know who is right? Now, we've talked about, in a recent podcast we did, is podcast 1712. It was a nutrition podcast titled Why Even Bad Diets Work. And the focus was on they work initially, and then they kind of tank. But I wanted to get you to think of a couple questions. I have 4 questions I want to present to you. So when you're considering a diet, and you're like, I don't know if I should follow this or not, here's 4 questions. First question is it sustainable? Is this a structure of eating that you can do for a long period of time? How long? However long you want to keep the results. If you want to lose 30 pounds and keep 30 pounds off, you're going to need to sustain what you did to get the 30 pounds off. Otherwise, you're going to go back to what you were doing that made you 30 pounds overweight in the first place. Does this make sense? Like, I have to change my eating habits to produce a change in my body. If I go back to my old eating habits afterwards, I'm going to go back to my whole body. So however long you want to sustain the results, you should be able to sustain some degree of that diet. Maybe you don't need as much of a caloric deficit once you lose the weight, but you still need to maintain some basic general structure to the diet, so that way you don't gain back the weight that you lost. So is the diet sustainable? You might find a diet that you're like, oh man, I can do this, I can lose 30 pounds in 30 days. But it's some outrageous conditions, and there's no way you're going to be able to do it for longer than 30 days. Or you'd have to take a drug to support the process, and you can't just keep taking the drug for the rest of your life. So we have to ask ourselves, is it sustainable? Can I do this for as long as I'd want to maintain the results? And a good kind of other question is, if it's not sustainable, if I'm like, well, I'm going to do it just for a short time, get a bunch of weight off, and then I'll be fine. No. Again, what are you going to do after the diet? If you go back to the eating habits that caused you to be overweight, you will go back to being overweight. So what are you going to do after the diet? Some of my clients in certain conditions, we have to get weight off real fast. So we do an extreme situation, extreme versions of diets, but we set it up in a way that they can just pull back on the extremeness of it, but still maintain the general premise of the diet. So that way they can maintain healthy habits after the diet. So they might lose 30 pounds in 30 days, and then we kind of pull back on that extremeness, and we keep certain parameters, but they're not as much of a deficit. They're not feeling so crappy and having any cravings. Maybe, 8 pounds creeps back on, but we know that was going to happen. And then they get to sustain 20 to 25-ish pounds off permanently. That's a normal kind of protocol to a diet. So if you do an extreme diet, you're going to have some kind of rebound out of that. because you're pushing your body into an extremely stressed state. And then once you pull back on the stress that you're pushing into the body, that you're creating around the body, once you pull back on the stress stimulus, the body's going to try to recover a little bit. And that recovery usually means it brings back in water retention, brings back in some other elements, tries to reproduce fat to help protect itself after it just had to dump a bunch of fat, which it sees as like a risk for long-term health. So is the diet sustainable? That is something you want to ask yourself. Is this something that I can continue to do, or at least a variation of it, for the long term, for however long I want to keep the results? Another question is it flexible? Does this diet allow me variance in food choice and food timing? You're likely going to need that because you can't predict how every single day of your life is going to go. Because of that, you can't always predict what foods you will have available to you and when you will be able to eat every single day. Right? So what are you going to do when you cannot follow the rules? If the rules are inflexible and there's no variance, what are you going to do when you cannot follow the rules, when you break the rules? How are you going to handle that mentally? Could you set yourself up with some choices that are, well, these aren't perfect food choices, but they're good enough? And if you're like, I'm never going to break the rules, I'm going to be so perfect on this, are you going to be mentally okay with what you have to give up to follow the rules? If somebody's getting ready for like a bodybuilding show, I've had a client tell me this before, like I've used this client's example before, but we were in an off season. And that means there's not like a competition coming up in the 12, 16 weeks. They're just in a building phase. And they're like, I want to eat so super perfect that I can gain as much muscle mass as possible. And they started dating at the time. And they wouldn't go to the movies. They wouldn't go do certain things because they're like, I have to eat every 2 hours. And I'm like, why? I didn't tell you that. I didn't tell you that you had to eat every 2 hours. And if you do need to do that, why can't you just take some foods with you and go do certain things? But I remember their significant other really liked to watch movies, and the client would not go to the movies with them because they said the movies were too long, and if they took food with them to the movie theater to eat during the movie, the significant other said that was kind of embarrassing. So they're like, well, if you don't want me to eat the movies, I'm not going to the movies. And I was like, what are you doing, dude? Like, what are you doing? You know, there's no reason for it to be that chaotic. So if it's not flexible, you either have to say, what am I going to do when I can't follow the rules? Or am I okay with what I have to give up to follow the rules? These are things we have to consider. A third question is it healthy? And in regard to this, I mean like blood marker health and like general concept of health. Typically losing body fat is going to be a healthy thing, yes. But does the diet cover like vitamin and mineral needs? Does it have like the basic essential fats that you might need? Protein? Do you have enough protein going in? Like, do we give our body enough? Or is it, I'm going to take this shot and I'm only going to eat 500 calories a day for a month? No. In 500 calories, you're not going to get enough protein. You're not going to get enough essential fats. That shot's masking an enormous amount of stress and an enormous amount of unhealthiness during that time frame. Now, it might be so short that you're like, well, I'm just going to do this for a short time. Okay. But again, what are you going to do afterwards? If you do it for a short time, even if it's unhealthy, you're like, I'm only going to do it for 4 weeks. I'm only going to do it for 8 weeks. Okay. Well, what are you going to do after that? What habits do you have in place that you're not going to go right back to the old habits and again go back to the old body? Right? Last question, and this one's a little bit challenging, and, you take it for what you want. But does it check out? If you go on YouTube and you search the name of your diet, don't watch a video by the person who made the diet. Okay? Maybe you can watch one, but don't take that as the only one you watch because they're going to tell you all the good stuff. But watch a couple people. Like, there's probably going to be like a YouTube video of some kind that's teaching about the diet or explaining about the diet in some way. What do people say about it? What do the people who support it say? What do the people who say it's a crap diet say? What does it look like? In the scope of the health industry, do you find 10 videos that say it's good to every one that say it's bad, or do you find 10 videos that say it's the worst thing in the world to one video that says it's good, and that one video is the person who made the diet? Right? So that's something to consider: is does it check out? What do the experts say about the diet? So these are just 4 basic questions that we can ask ourselves when we're considering a diet and we're thinking, is this a good diet? Is it sustainable? Is it flexible? Is it healthy? Does it check out? What do the experts say about it? Okay, I thought that would just be fun, just to take from the conversation I was having with the listener, and thought that others might benefit from that. Hope you ask those questions. If you have any considerations of diets, or if you have any extra questions, just shoot me an email at brutalirongym@gmail.com. If you like our podcast, please share the podcast. If you like the podcast, please consider donating to support the podcast, which you can do on our website. If you like the information we share, you can find more from us on Instagram and YouTube. You can find us and follow us under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.